So we are, starting a new series of talks that are going to happen throughout April, a little bit into May as well. And this is all about some women in the Old Testament. The Old Testament is the first part of the Bible written before Jesus. It's a story of God's relationship with the Israelites, with the people of Israel prior to Jesus coming. And in this talk, we really want to celebrate some of these less well-known women of the Old Testament. And it is easy to miss them. Most of the characters in both the Old Testament and the New Testament are men. Apparently only 10%, actually less than 10% of all named individuals in the Old Testament are women. That isn't particularly surprising of its time, as in ancient Near Eastern cultures, such as Israelite culture and other cultures around the Israelite people at the time, it was men who held most of the power. They were the decision makers, they held the leadership positions generally, they wrote the history. Yet, as we're going to hopefully see over the coming weeks, women did some incredible things at this time in history. Sometimes they defined and defied narrow societal expectations of them, and at other times they used the power and influence that they did have to change the course of history. Now, in this series, we're not going to be focusing on some of the bigger name women of the Old Testament, so you may or may not come across books of the Bible such as Ruth and Esther. These are remarkable women, but we're not going to be focusing on them during this series. We're going to be focusing on the ones you may not have heard so much about. It is important to mention Ruth and Esther, though, because these were women who, as I've said, were living in a society where there were close boundaries set around what they could and couldn't do, largely by the men. But these women, Ruth and Esther, were incredibly shrewd, courageous, loving, and they changed their lives, they changed other people's lives. Especially in Esther's case, she transformed the lives of all of her people. She rescued them from death. But we're going to be focusing on some other women. And some of the women that we're going to look at over the next few weeks were women like Abigail, the Shamanite woman, maybe the noble woman of Proverbs 31. These were women who did kind of more ordinary things. They had influence in the domestic realm generally. These were the women who kept others alive, who managed their households incredibly successfully. Now, I came across a scholar, a lady called Dr. Carol Myers, who's a biblical scholar who has a special interest in archaeology and in women of the biblical world. And she argues, including in her groundbreaking book, which if you're interested in this, you might want to find. Her book is called Discovering Eve, Ancient Israelite Women in Context. She argues that women during this period were responsible for the household. They were responsible for food production. They kept everybody alive, from milling the flour to making the bread. And we will find women in the Old Testament, and those that aren't necessarily mentioned in the Old Testament as well, who almost acted as like the CEOs, the household managers, organizing the lives of large extended families. So as I said, as we take this journey over the coming weeks, reflecting on the lives of some important women, celebrating their contribution, and acknowledging that there were limitations placed around them because of their society, I think we also want to acknowledge that there are still many women and girls in the world today who face huge amounts of discrimination, oppression, and sometimes violence simply because of their sex. And it's worth noting that even here in the UK, even though so much progress has been made over the years to ensure that women and men are treated as equals, it was only last June 2025, that the UK police chiefs compiled a report that said that violence in the UK against women and girls is now a national emergency, requiring a whole system approach. All the different parts, education, criminal justice, health, policing, everybody working together to tackle it. And they're particularly concerned about the rise in online misogyny and violence against women and girls. And it remains the case today, and this is really shocking if you haven't heard this before, that every 3 days in the UK, a woman is killed by a man. As a church, we want to do all we can to ensure that all girls and all women, both in the Church of Jesus and in wider society, know exactly how precious and valuable they are, that the way that they've been made by God and their contributions are equally valuable in God's eyes, that God sees them and knows them. And we also want to be a people that stand up against injustice wherever we find it, whether it's injustice against women and girls or against people of different ethnic groups or whoever they are. Now, I want to be clear, this series is certainly not about bashing men. Don't worry, men. If you feel like you're going to have a really hard time this morning, you're not. It's really about just raising the profile of some of the women of the Old Testament. It's also not a series that's only applicable to the women in our church. Rather, we hope that all of us, whatever our gender, whatever our age, whoever we are, whether we have faith in God or whether we don't, might be able to take something from some of these incredible lives that we're going to meet. And most importantly, that we might learn something about these women's relationship with an even more incredible God. So, that said, we're going to look this morning at Judges, chapter 4 in the book of Judges. It's not that far from the beginning of your Bible, if you have a Bible, about that far in, if you can see. Don't worry if you don't have a Bible. I'm going to read it out to you. I haven't put all the words up on the screen because it's a bit long, and my fingers can't quite type fast enough, but listen to the words. If you have a Bible or if you want to Google this on your phone, it's Judges chapter 4. Just before we read these words, I'm just going to give you a really, really brief summary so you know where we're kind of arriving when we meet the story in Judges chapter 4. So at this point in history, the Israelite people, so these were God's kind of special people at this point in history. He'd chosen a special group, the aim being that this group of people, the Israelites, were meant to take God to all peoples of the earth, but it often and usually didn't quite work out like that. And yet again, Israel had had a time of peace and prosperity. They'd followed God for a while. They'd had a good leader, a man called Ehud, and then he died. And as generally happened, they then forgot about God. And they entered this same old cycle that we see repeated in Judges and in some of the other Old Testament books, where they forgot about God, they went their own way, they started worshipping other gods, and then they get taken over by another group of people. They end up being essentially slaves, oppressed by another ethnic group. In this case, it was a Canaanite king called Jabin, we're going to hear him mentioned briefly, and his military commander, Sisera. And this group of people had oppressed the Israelites for over 20 years when we begin our story in Judges chapter 4. And then after 20 years, as is the familiar pattern in the Old Testament, is they get fed up of being oppressed by other people and they cry out to God and they say, Lord, would you rescue us from our oppressors? And then that's when God intervenes and he does just that. So, Judges chapter 4. Again, the Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord now that Ehud had died. So the Lord sold them into the hands of Jabin, king of Canaan, who reigned in Hazor. Sisera, the commander of his army, was based in Harosheth. Because he had 900 chariots fitted with iron and had cruelly oppressed the Israelites for 20 years, they cried to the Lord for help. Now Deborah, a prophet, the wife of Lapthadoth, was leading Israel at that time. She held court under the palm of Deborah between Ramah and Bethel in the hill country of Ephraim. And the Israelites went up to her to have their disputes decided. She sent for Barak, son of Abinum, from Kadesh in Naphtali, and said to him, The Lord, the God of Israel, commands you, go, take with you 10,000 men of Naphtali and Zebulun, and lead them up to Mount Tabor. I will lead Sisera, the commander of Jabin's army, with his chariots and his troops to the Kishon River, and I will give them into your hands. Barak said to her, If you go with me, I will go. But if you don't go with me, I won't go. Certainly, I will go with you, said Deborah. But because of the course you are taking, the honor will not be yours. For the Lord will deliver Sisera into the hands of a woman. So Deborah went with Barak to Kadesh. There Barak summoned Zebulun and Naphtali, and 10,000 men went up under his command. Deborah also went up with him. Now Heber the Canaanite had left the other Canaanites, the descendants of Hobab, Moses' brother-in-law, and pitched his tent by the great tree in Zephanaim near Kadesh. When they told Sisera that Barak, son of Abinoam, had gone up to Mount Tabor, Sisera summoned for I'm really struggling with all these words. Harosheth. Anyway, I won't even try and pronounce the next one. To the Kishon River, all his men and his 900 chariots fitted with iron. Then Deborah said to Barak, "Go. This is the day the Lord has given Sisera into your hands. Has not the Lord gone ahead of you?" So Barak went down Mount Tabor with 10,000 men following him. At Barak's advance, the Lord routed Sisera and all his chariots and army by the sword. And Sisera got down from his chariot and he fled on foot. Barak pursued the chariots and army as far as Harosheth, and all the Sisera's troops fell by the sword, not a man was left. Sisera, meanwhile, fled on foot to the tent of Jael, the wife of Heber the Kenite, because there was an alliance between Jabin, king of Hazor, and the family of Heber the Kenite. Jael went out to meet Sisera and said to him, "Come, my lord, come right in, don't be afraid." So he entered her tent, and she covered him with a blanket. "I'm thirsty," he said, "please give me some water." She opened a skin of milk, gave him a drink, and covered him up. "Stand in the doorway of the tent," he told her. "If someone comes by and asks you, 'Is anyone in there?' say no." But Jael, Heber's wife, picked up a tent peg and a hammer and went quietly to him while he lay fast asleep, exhausted. She drove the peg through his temple, into the ground, and Barak died. Just then Barak came by, not Barak, that was Sisera died. Just then Barak came by in pursuit of Sisera, and Jael went out to meet him. "Come," she said, "I will show you the man that you're looking for." So he went in with her, and there lay Sisera with the tent peg through his temple, dead. On that day, God subdued Jabin, king of Canaan, before the Israelites, and the hand of the Israelites pressed harder and harder against Jabin, king of Canaan, until they destroyed him. So, other than quite a lot of tricky place names, there are some interesting, somewhat gruesome details and interesting parts of the story going on here, and various different characters. Now, the three that we're going to focus on this morning are two women and a man. We're going to focus on Deborah, we're going to focus on Barak, and we're going to focus on Jael. And how these three people together, two women and one man, help ensure that there is peace for God's people for 40 years. So firstly, Deborah, and I think a few little thoughts about her are going to come up on the screen behind me. So as we meet Deborah, we meet a highly unusual woman in history, and certainly in the history of Israel. She is a leader of God's people, Israel. In fact, she is the only one that we know of. That is amazing in and of itself. How exactly she came to be in this position, to be a leader, to be someone called a judge of the Israelites, we're not completely sure about, but it would certainly have been because she possessed leadership qualities. Now, usually the main way that people became leaders of Israel at this time, they became judges, was by proving themselves as military leaders so that people came to respect them. There was a second way, a less common way, that some people became judges. And another example of this is someone called Eli, the high priest, who became a judge. And you can read about him in 1 Samuel chapter 4. He became a judge because he was an expert in biblical law and in settling people's disputes. Now, as a woman, Deborah could not have excelled as a military leader. That was not an option available to her. So it is highly likely that she was chosen to be judge, to be leader of the Israelites, for the second reason, because of her ability to lead people as a spiritual leader. And in fact, we're told in chapter 4 that she was a prophet. That means that she was someone who heard from God in a really special way, very clearly, and she delivered God's messages to his people. Her leadership involved providing people with divine guidance from God, But we're also told in this chapter that she was very good at resolving conflicts between people. Hence, that's why she goes and sits and judges people's disputes under the palm of Deborah. We see Deborah's leadership here as deeply significant for her people. She leads them in all domains of Israelite life. In the spiritual realm, she's also leading them in the civil realm. She's resolving their disputes. This was a time before they had courts of law, so she was acting as that kind of person. And even here we see her acting in a military sense. Although she's not on the battlefield herself, she is basically initiating and dictating what's going to happen on the battlefield. She initiates through her prophetic gifting this great military victory. And we learn a few more things about Deborah here that I think are really remarkable. As we've said, she clearly hears very clearly from God. She has this special prophetic gift. But she also exercises that gift with great wisdom. That's the kind of bit that she has control of. What does she do with that gift? Does she use it for herself, or does she use it to serve others? And we see Deborah here having complete confidence in God's ability to do all things, even the remarkable, even the impossible. She simply is God's mouthpiece here. She shares what he has told her. So we see Deborah telling Barak to take 10,000 men and then to go out and fight their oppressors, the army led by Sisera. And she says to Barak that the Lord is going to lead Sisera to you and give him to you in battle. And then later on, she says to Barak in verse 10, "Now go. This is the time," she says to him. "Has not the Lord gone ahead of you?" So she seems to have complete confidence, complete faith that the Lord is in charge. He knows what he's doing, that all is going to be well, and that he can even do miracles. You know, the Israelite army, there was no way that they should have defeated Jabin's army. They had all the latest military tech. They had 900 chariots. The Israelites should have been defeated, but yet it is completely the other way around. We also see Deborah here being a brilliant leader in how she supports others, namely Barak. Barak says to her, "I need you to go with me." For some reason, he feels he can't do this by himself. He needs Deborah with him. And she is a good leader because she won't ask anyone to go somewhere where she is not prepared to go. So she joins him. So that's a bit about Deborah. Barak. In this story, Barak, I think, shows both doubt. It's interesting that Martin mentioned kind of the doubts that we can all have in God. Those are entirely normal. Barak is a very normal, understandable kind of guy. He seems to demonstrate both doubts in God's ability, but also incredible faith in his God. As I said, he wants Deborah with him in battle. He's not just prepared to accept her word that God knows what he's doing. He needs Deborah to be with him. He maybe needs her for spiritual support because of the quality and depth of her relationship with God. And we see Deborah here rebuking Barak on God's behalf, maybe for this lack of faith. She tells him that he is not going to get the honor for the military victory that is to come. In fact, a woman is going to get that honor. However, we also see Barak in this story having incredible faith. And it's important to note that if you turn to the New Testament, to the book of Hebrews and chapter 11, which is sometimes kind of known as like the roll call of the faithful, Barak is listed there amongst the faithful. And even in this story, we see Barak doing something incredible. There's a little verse that says that Barak went down from Mount Tabor with 10,000 men. That might not seem particularly significant, but actually that is, because this was a wonderful act of faith on his part. He essentially moved his army to flatter ground where his armies were at a greater disadvantage against the enemy's chariots. They no longer had the high ground on the mountain, they were now on the low ground. But still, the Lord wins the battle. And then finally, Jael. Now, she is a very different kind of woman from Deborah. She is probably rather more of a typical woman. She is not a leader. She's got no special influence and power. She's a homemaker. She's a more ordinary kind of a woman. And we meet Jael here when the battle is almost done, but not completely done. Sisera still lives. He has fled the battleground, and he's trying to hide amongst some people who he thinks will take care of him and keep him safe. And so he goes to Jael's tent, which was not a normal thing for a male military leader to do. But he goes there because he knows that Jael's family, particularly her husband, has got an alliance, a kind of relationship, a promise with the king of Jabin, the king of Sisera's people. So he thinks that Jael is going to keep him safe. And Jael, as we see in the story, plays every bit the warm, caring host who makes Sisera feel incredibly secure in her presence. She's kind to him. She gives him some nice warm milk. She puts a blanket over him, and in his exhaustion from the battle, he falls asleep. Now, Jael, as a homemaker in this time, she would have been the one, it would have been the women who set up camp. They would have put the tents up. So she knew how to use a tent peg, and this is obviously the rather gruesome bit. Because she takes whatever she has near her, she takes the thing that she knows how to use, and she uses it as a lethal weapon. Now, we're not really sure quite why she does this. It is a rather strange and actually rather dangerous thing for Jael to have done. She was helping a group of people that were not her own people. She was part of a Canaanite tribe. She wasn't an Israelite herself. So we're not really sure why she wanted Sisera dead. And it was particularly dangerous because as a woman, she was meant to be the host. So she was going against everything that she was meant to do as a woman. She would have been seen as a traitor by her own people. Particularly so because she was breaking this promise, this alliance between her husband and King Jabin and Sisera. So in doing this gruesome act, she exercises enormous faith and courage. Faith and courage in a God that wasn't necessarily her people's own God. But God still uses her to do this incredible thing and to defeat Sisera's army. So 2 amazing women, 1 amazing man. But actually, I just want, before we end, to turn our attention to the amazing God of this story. Because, yes, this is an incredible story. You're not going to find many chapters in the Old or New Testament where there are 2 such amazing women. However, I don't want us to lose sight of the fact that there is an even more incredible God. How is God so amazing in this chapter? Well, firstly, he is so gracious. He shows his people such undeserved mercy. As I said at the beginning, it was the normal pattern that the people of Israel, they followed God for a time, then they got fed up for whatever reason. They started following other gods. They forgot about God, and then they were oppressed by a group of other people. They got fed up with that. They cried out to God, and then God comes and rescues them. God here, once again, hears the cries of his people, as he has done so many times throughout the Old Testament, and he turns his ear towards them when they ask for his help. They couldn't sort themselves out. They couldn't make things right for themselves. They couldn't defeat Jabin and his incredibly successful army. Only God could. And that's exactly what we see God doing here. We see him doing the miraculous. He is a miracle worker. He is able to do all things. And what's even more amazing is that he uses unconventional methods here and unconventional people to accomplish his purposes. He uses the ordinary in extraordinary ways. So firstly, we see God here, although it's a little bit subtle, we might miss this, but we actually see God likely manipulating the weather, as we see God do lots of times in the Bible, in the Old Testament and the New Testament. At points in the Bible, we see God making storms calm, or we see God bringing storms, or we see God bringing rain or withholding rain. And this is what is likely we see here. Because most people seem to think that it was a rainstorm that caused Sisera's 900 chariots to get stuck in the mud so that they couldn't work. God also used the weather in our nation at a really important time in our history. You may have heard of this, or you may not have heard of this story before, but it's become to be known as the miracle of Dunkirk. Because on May the 26th, 1940, King George at the time called the people of the UK for a national day of prayer. Because there were 300,000 plus Allied soldiers trapped in France, in Dunkirk, and it looked highly likely that the Nazis were going to surround this group of soldiers and they were going to slaughter them. And so after the king had called for this national day of prayer, millions of Britons across the land filled churches or prayed in their homes for God to intervene. And remarkably, a storm came. It grounded the Luftwaffe, the Nazi Air Force, and there was also an unusually calm waters over the channel. These two things coming together, these weather events, meant that thousands of small boats were able to come from Kent and Dover and that kind of area to come over to France to evacuate over 335,000 soldiers, taking them back to safety in the UK. What followed was a national day of thanksgiving on June the 9th, 1940, where many in churches sang and recited Psalm 124, verse 2. If the Lord himself had not been on our side when people attacked us, they would have swallowed us alive when their anger flared against us. God can use the weather in remarkable ways. And I think also this story reminds us that God uses prayer. And it's interesting that we're in this season, Josh mentioned it earlier, called Strike the Ground, which is all about calling Christians in the UK to pray for our nation, a bit like King George did in 1940. Over last week and this week, we're hopefully going to be joining with thousands of Christians to pray for God to intervene for our nation. Not because at the moment we're in the midst of a physical war, but we are in the midst of a spiritual one, and we long for many to know God for themselves. So maybe this is an encouragement for us to get praying. God can do miraculous things. We also see in our story of Deborah and Jael, we also see God using unlikely people and objects for his purposes. He uses anyone who is open, willing, and demonstrates a little bit of faith. He is not deterred by their social standing, by their gender, by their age, by their vocation, by their ethnicity. In this story, God uses Deborah, the only female judge of Israel, and he uses Jael, probably an even more unlikely candidate, a lower-ranking, ordinary woman, not even one of God's chosen people, who uses just what she has at her disposal, that tent peg. So as we finish, and we're going to have a time just to kind of reflect and pause and pray in a moment, just a few thoughts on maybe some things that we might take with us from Judges chapter 4. Firstly, there is a God who is so gracious. He is so full of mercy that whatever our past, wherever we've been, however we've ignored or rejected him, that it's never too late to turn to him, that he will always come to meet us. He is always ready to save us, always ready to rescue us. And he can do all things. He is a miracle worker. He can change the weather. He can use ordinary people and ordinary objects to fulfill his purposes. He can use you and he can use me. He has great plans for all of our lives. All that is needed is a simple yes. So how about if you want to, you might just find it helpful to close your eyes. Just helps us concentrate a little bit more sometimes. But this is just a moment just to kind of pause and collect our thoughts and reflect on some of those characters that we've met in Judges chapter 4. Reflect on the God that we've heard about in chapter 4.